Welcome to our deep dive into postmodernism. It's
Oh,
a topic that can sound kind of intimidating at first glance,
right.
but trust me, folks, it's way more relevant to your everyday life than you might think.
Absolutely.
We're going to unpack this movement that emerged in the mid-20th century and really shook things up in terms of how we see the world.
Yeah.
So to kick things off, could you give us a little background on what exactly postmodernism is?
So, postmodernism, it's not really a single philosophy.
Okay.
It's more like a collection of ideas that challenge those big overarching narratives we often use to explain the world. So those truths that seem set in stone. Well, postmodernism comes along and asks, but are they really?
So, like, instead of just accepting things at face value, postmodernism encourages us to be more critical and question those big picture explanations.
Exactly.
Okay, so I'm already intrigued, but before we get too deep, can you give us a little context?
Here.
Like, where did this postmodernism thing even come from?
Well, picture the world after World War II. Modernism, with its focus on reason and progress, had been the dominant way of thinking.
Right.
But then came the horrors of the war, followed by the Cold War, and people started to doubt those grand narratives of progress and certainty.
Yeah, that makes sense. I
Yeah.
mean, if reason and progress can lead to something as devastating as World War II, then maybe we shouldn't just blindly accept them as the ultimate truths.
Right. It's like if reason can lead to that kind of destruction, can we really trust it blindly?
So instead of blindly accepting those big truths, what did postmodernism propose?
A more critical approach.
Okay.
It suggests that truth and knowledge are often relative, influenced by culture history, and even who's in power at the time.
So truth isn't just this universal objective thing.
Right.
It actually depends on who you are and where you're standing.
Exactly.
That's a pretty radical idea.
It is.
I mean, it really challenges how we usually think about knowledge and truth.
It does, and it can be applied to so many different areas,
Like what?
like marketing campaigns.
Oh, interesting. I like it.
Those that try to sell you the one perfect beauty product. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Postmodernism would say, wait a minute,
Okay.
whose idea of beauty is this?
Right.
And who benefits from pushing this idea?
That's such a great point because it makes you realize how much of what we accept as truth is actually shaped by external forces, whether it's the media advertising or even just our own cultural upbringing.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've touched upon this idea of questioning grand narratives and the idea that truth and knowledge can be relative. Are there any other key concepts we should know about when it comes to postmodernism?
Yeah, there are a few others that are really central to understanding this movement.
Okay, let's hear them.
One of the big ones is relativism.
Relativism. Okay, break that down for me. What exactly does that mean?
Essentially, it means that truth is not absolute, but depends on your perspective.
Okay.
What's considered true can vary depending on the context, the culture, even the individual.
So something that's considered normal in one culture might be totally out there in another.
Exactly.
Or even something as basic as what's considered beautiful.
Precisely, think about beauty standards.
Right.
They change drastically across time periods and cultures.
Yeah, what was considered like the epitome of beauty in the Victorian era is totally different from what's considered beautiful today.
Exactly.
And it's always changing.
Yeah, relativism helps us understand that these standards are not set in stone, but are constructed by society.
It's like fashion, what's in one year can be completely out the next.
Right.
There's no universal standard. It's all relative.
Exactly. And this leads us to another core concept in postmodernism: fragmentation.
Fragmentation. Okay, that sounds kind of ominous. What exactly is being fragmented?
Well, postmodernism sees reality itself as fragmented,
Oh,
lacking a unified structure. Think of it like a puzzle,
uh-huh.
where you have all these pieces, but they don't necessarily fit together neatly.
So instead of seeing the world as this orderly, predictable system, postmodernism is saying it's more like a kaleidoscope, where everything is constantly shifting,
Yes.
and there's no single complete picture.
That's a great analogy.
Thanks.
And this fragmentation is often reflected in postmodern art and literature.
Okay.
Think about those experimental novels with multiple narrators, or those abstract paintings that seem to break all the rules.
I see.
They embrace the ambiguity and the lack of a clear, singular meaning.
It's like they're saying, hey, life is messy, so why pretend that art has to be neat and tidy?
Exactly. Now, speaking of breaking things down,
Yeah.
we can't talk about postmodernism without mentioning deconstruction.
Deconstruction.
Yeah,
That sounds pretty intense, and to be honest, a little confusing.
it can be.
Can you give us like a clear, down-to-earth explanation?
Sure, it's a concept developed by the philosopher Jacques Derrida,
Okay.
and it's all about challenging the assumption that words have fixed, stable meanings.
Okay.
Derrida argued that meaning is created through differences and oppositions between words.
Okay, so how does that work in practice? Give me an example.
Let's take a simple word like tree. If you ask a poet to describe a tree, you'll get a very different answer than if you ask a lumberjack, right?
Yeah. Can you say that?
Their perspectives, their needs, shape how they understand and use that word.
So it's not that the dictionary definition of tree is wrong.
Right.
It's that the word gains different layers of meaning depending on who's using it and in what context.
Exactly. Deconstruction helps us see that language is not neutral. It's loaded with cultural baggage and hidden power dynamics.
Wow, I never thought of it that way, but it makes total sense.
Yeah.
It's like words are constantly playing these mind games with us, making us think they have one meaning when they actually hold a whole universe of potential interpretations.
And that brings us to another mind-bending concept, hyperreality.
Hyperreality. Okay, now we're getting into sci-fi territory.
A little bit.
What's that all about?
It's a term coined by the philosopher Jean Baudrillard,
Okay.
and it basically describes a situation where simulations and representations of reality become more real than reality itself.
Hold on, I need an example here because my brain is starting to feel a bit fragmented.
Think about reality TV shows.
Okay.
Are they really a reflection of real life, or are they carefully constructed performances for the camera?
That's a good question.
Baudrillard would argue that these shows create a hyperreality, a version of reality that is more dramatic, more exciting, and ultimately more appealing than the mundane reality we experience day to day.
So it's like we become so engrossed in these simulated realities that we lose touch with what's actually real.
Exactly. And this blurring of lines between reality and simulation is a key characteristic of postmodernism. It's all around us, not just in TV shows, but in advertising, social media, and even the way we present ourselves online.
Right. It's like that saying, don't believe everything you see on the internet.
Exactly.
But now it's not just about cat videos. It's about questioning whether what we see online is even a remotely accurate representation of reality.
Right. And this ties into another concept, intertextuality.
Okay, intertextuality, what's that?
It highlights how everything is connected, referencing and drawing from other texts and cultural artifacts. Think about how many movies quote older films or songs that sample older tracks, or even memes that play on familiar images and ideas.
Oh, I see. So instead of striving for complete originality, it's more about remixing and reinterpreting existing elements.
Exactly. Postmodernism embraces this web of interconnectedness, seeing creativity as a process of building upon and transforming what came before.
Okay, so we've got all these heady concepts swirling around: grand narratives, relativism, fragmentation, deconstruction, hyperreality, intertextuality. It's like a whole new language. But how does this actually play out in the real world? I mean, how did these postmodern ideas influence different fields like philosophy, art, and literature?
Well, that's where it gets really fascinating. Postmodernism had a huge impact on how we think about power, identity, knowledge, and even the very nature of reality itself. Let's start with philosophy.
Right.
Michel Foucault, a very influential postmodern thinker, explored how power structures shape knowledge and control within institutions like prisons and hospitals.
So it's like the people in charge get to define what's considered true or normal within those systems.
Precisely. Foucault argued that knowledge is not neutral, it's always tied to power. He challenged us to think critically about who holds the power to define knowledge and how that power is used to maintain control.
So if you think about it, that applies to so many areas of life, right?
It does.
From schools and workplaces to governments and the media, there are always power dynamics at play that influence what's considered true or acceptable.
Absolutely. And that's just one example of how postmodernism has challenged traditional ways of thinking and opened up new avenues for understanding the complexities of the world.
This is already giving me so much to think about. I'm really starting to see how these postmodern ideas have seeped into so many aspects of our lives, even if we're not aware of it.
And we've only just scratched the surface.
I know. I'm ready to dive deeper into those other areas you mentioned, like art, literature, and how postmodernism is playing out in our digital world. But I think that's a good place to pause for now. We'll pick up where we left off in part 2 of this deep dive, so stay tuned because things are about to get even more interesting.
Definitely.
Welcome back to our deep dive into postmodernism.
Thanks for having me back.
Last time we laid the groundwork, exploring those mind-bending concepts.
Right.
like
Yeah.
relativism, fragmentation, and deconstruction.
Yeah, some pretty heady stuff.
It is. But now I'm curious to see how these ideas actually play out in like how we understand ourselves and the world around us.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, that's a great segue because postmodernism really shook things up when it comes to how we think about identity.
Identity. Okay, so
Yeah.
before we get into that, can you remind us, like, what was the traditional view of identity, before postmodernism came along?
Well, traditionally, identity was often seen as something fixed and stable.
Okay.
You were born into a certain role defined by things like your family, your ethnicity, or social class.
Right.
It was like you were given a label at birth, and that was that.
So it's like you were assigned to a specific box and you were expected to stay in it.
Exactly. But postmodernism challenges that whole idea.
It does.
Yeah.
So how so?
Postmodern thinkers argue that identity is not fixed, but fluid, constructed, and constantly evolving.
Okay.
It's shaped by our experiences, our interactions, and the cultural narratives we're exposed to.
So it's not that those traditional categories are meaningless,
Right.
but they're not the whole story.
Exactly.
Like we're not just passive recipients of our identity. We're actively shaping and reshaping it throughout our lives.
Precisely. And this fluidity of identity is closely tied to the concept of performativity.
Performative. Okay, that sounds intriguing.
Yeah.
What exactly does that mean?
Well, it was explored in depth by the feminist philosopher Judith Butler,
Okay.
and she suggests that gender in particular is not something we are, but something we do.
We do. Okay.
It's a performance, a series of repeated actions and expressions that create the illusion of a stable, coherent identity.
So it's like we're all actors on a stage playing out these roles that society expects of us. And maybe even internalizing those roles to the point where they feel like our true selves.
Exactly. And this performance is influenced by cultural norms, power dynamics, and even language itself.
It's like we're constantly code switching, putting on different masks to fit in or to project a certain image.
Right.
And that makes me wonder, is there even a real self underneath all these performances?
That's a question that postmodernism grapples with.
It does.
Yeah, it challenges us to question those easy assumptions about a fixed essential self.
So it's not that we're being fake or inauthentic.
No, not necessarily.
It's more like we're constantly negotiating our identity in relation to the world around us.
Exactly. And this fluidity of identity can be liberating for some, as it allows for greater self-expression and exploration.
Right.
But it can also be unsettling for those who crave stability in clear-cut categories.
It's definitely a complex issue with no easy answers.
For sure.
And speaking of complexity, how did postmodernism influence our understanding of language itself?
Oh, that's a big one.
We touched on deconstruction earlier.
Right.
But I'm curious to hear more about how that plays out, like specifically in relation to language.
Well, remember how we talked about how deconstruction challenges the idea that words have fixed, stable meanings?
Right. It's like words are these slippery little creatures that can change their meaning depending on who's using them and in what context.
Exactly. Postmodern thinkers argue that language is not a neutral tool for representing reality. It's inherently unstable, loaded with cultural biases, and shaped by power dynamics.
So it's not just about analyzing poetry or philosophy.
It's about everything.
It's about questioning how language itself shapes our entire worldview.
Exactly. And this brings us to another key aspect of postmodern thought. Its critique of traditional notions of history.
I'm intrigued. How does postmodernism shake up our understanding of the past?
Traditionally, history was often presented as a grand narrative, a linear progression of events with clear causes and effects.
Okay.
But postmodern historians challenge this view,
They do.
arguing that history is not objective, but rather a construction, a story we tell ourselves about the past.
So those history textbooks we read in school,
Yes.
they might not be giving us the whole picture.
Right.
It's more like they're presenting one version of events shaped by the biases and perspectives of the people who wrote them.
Exactly. Postmodern historians emphasize the importance of multiple perspectives and the role of power in shaping historical narratives.
So it's not just about the facts and dates.
It's about interpretation.
It's about who gets to tell the story, whose voices are amplified, and whose are silenced.
Precisely.
That's a really important point. It makes you realize that history is not just about what happened, but about how we make sense of it and whose perspectives are privileged in that process.
Right. And this postmodern perspective has led to a greater focus on marginalized histories, those stories that were often ignored or silenced in traditional accounts.
So it's like history's being rewritten not by changing the facts, but by expanding the narrative to include more perspectives.
Exactly. And this has had a profound impact on our understanding of everything from colonialism and slavery to gender and sexuality.
Wow. It's amazing to see how these postmodern ideas have reshaped our understanding of such fundamental aspects of human experience.
It has been a major shift.
Identity, language, history. It's like postmodernism is this intellectual earthquake that keeps sending out aftershocks,
Yeah.
challenging our assumptions, and making us re-examine everything we thought we knew.
It's certainly been a transformative force, and it's not just confined to academia or intellectual debates. These ideas have filtered into popular culture, influencing everything from movies and music to fashion and advertising.
So it's not just some abstract theory, it's all around us shaping how we see the world and ourselves within it.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so fascinating and at times challenging. It forces us to question assumptions, embrace complexity, and recognize that there might not be easy answers.
It's like a constant invitation to think critically and to be aware of the power dynamics and cultural biases that shape our perceptions.
Precisely. And that's a valuable skill in today's world where we're bombarded with information from all sides.
I couldn't agree more. We've covered so much ground here, and I'm already feeling like I need to go back and re-listen to all of this to fully absorb it.
It's definitely a lot to digest.
But before we move on to the last part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I think it's important to acknowledge that not everyone is on board with this postmodern train of thought. You know,
Of course.
there are some valid criticisms and concerns that we need to address.
Absolutely. Postmodernism is not without its critics, and some of their arguments raise important questions about the implications of these ideas.
So stay tuned for part 3, where we'll tackle some of the criticisms of postmodernism, explore its impact on our relationship with technology, and of course leave you with some thought-provoking questions to ponder. We'll see you there. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into postmodernism.
It's been a great conversation.
It has. We've explored some pretty mind-bending concepts, but now it's time to get real and address the criticisms.
Right.
Because let's face it, no intellectual movement is without its flaws. So let's dive right in. What are some of the main criticisms leveled against postmodernism?
Well, one of the most common critiques is that its emphasis on relativism can lead to a sort of moral and intellectual paralysis.
Moral and intellectual paralysis.
Yeah, okay. If there are no absolute truths, how do we make judgments about right and wrong?
Right.
Or even distinguish between facts and opinions?
That's a big one. I mean, if everything is relative, doesn't it become really difficult to fight for social justice or hold people accountable for harmful actions?
Exactly.
It's how can you say something is objectively wrong if truth is always subjective?
Right. That's a key concern. Critics argue that postmodernism can undermine our ability to establish shared values and make progress on important social issues.
Yeah. If everyone has their own truth, how can we find common ground?
Exactly.
And the whole deconstruction thing, while it's fascinating, I can see how it might make some people feel like the rug is being pulled out from under them.
I understand that.
It's if we can deconstruct everything, does anything really have meaning?
That's another valid criticism. Some find postmodernism's emphasis on fragmentation and the instability of meaning to be nihilistic or even paralyzing.
Right.
If nothing is fixed or certain, well, what's the point of striving for anything?
Yeah. Why bother trying to make sense of the world if there's no inherent meaning to be found?
Right.
It can definitely feel like a recipe for apathy or despair if you take it too far.
I agree. And on a more practical level, some postmodern writing can be incredibly dense and jargon-filled, making it inaccessible to anyone outside of academia.
Yeah, it's you need a PhD in philosophy just to understand what they're talking about. But despite these criticisms, it's clear that postmodernism has had a profound impact on how we think about ourselves and the world, especially in this age of the internet and social media.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In fact, some argue that the internet itself embodies many postmodern ideas.
Oh, really? How so?
The blurring of boundaries between reality and virtuality,
Right.
the fragmentation of information, and the emphasis on individual perspectives and user-generated content.
It's like the internet is this giant postmodern playground where everyone has a voice and information is constantly being remixed and reinterpreted. And with social media, we're constantly constructing and performing our identities online, just like Judith Butler talked about.
Exactly. We curate our profiles, filter our photos, and present carefully crafted versions of ourselves to the world.
It's all about image and perception in the digital age.
It really is.
And with the rise of things like deepfakes and misinformation, it's become even harder to distinguish between truth and fiction. It's we're living in this hyper-real world where reality itself is up for grabs.
That's a key challenge we face in the 21st century.
Mm-hmm.
How do we navigate this postmodern landscape where information is fragmented, truth is contested, and identities are fluid?
It's a question that keeps coming up again and again.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the point of postmodernism, not to provide all the answers, but to make us question, to make us think critically, and to be aware of the complexities of our world.
You've hit the nail on the head. Perhaps it's less about finding definitive solutions and more about embracing the ambiguity, recognizing the limitations of our knowledge, and being open to multiple perspectives.
So even if we don't agree with all of its ideas, postmodernism serves as this important reminder to question everything, to challenge assumptions, and to be aware of the power dynamics at play in shaping our reality.
Exactly. And that's a valuable skill no matter where you stand on the philosophical spectrum. It helps us become more discerning consumers of information, more critical thinkers, and ultimately more engaged citizens.
Well said. Well, folks, we've reached the end of our deep dive into postmodernism. It's been a whirlwind tour through a complex and often challenging landscape of ideas. But hopefully you've come away with a better understanding of this influential movement, its strengths, its weaknesses, and its lasting impact on our world.
It's been a pleasure discussing this with you.
Likewise, and remember, folks, the conversation doesn't end here. You can continue exploring these ideas on your own. Check out some of those thinkers we mentioned. Lyotard, Foucault, Derrida, Baudrillard, and see what resonates with you.
You might be surprised how much these ideas are already shaping your own thinking.
Exactly. And perhaps the most important takeaway from this deep dive is this: don't be afraid to question everything. Challenge assumptions, embrace complexity, be open to new perspectives.
That's the essence of the postmodern spirit.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of Deep Dive. Until next time, keep those minds open and those questions coming.